Welcome to the panel on security and human rights, aligning key standards and the UN guiding principles. If you meant to attend the panel on employment sector, the financial sector, or the MSI initiative, now would be a very good time to discreetly and nonchalantly back out one of those doors. My name is Gare Smith. I chair the corporate social responsibility practice at the law firm Foley, Hoag, and our practice group serves as the secretariat for the Voluntary Principles on Security and Human Rights. It's my privilege today to serve as the chair for this multi-stakeholder initiative. We are fortunate to have with us a very distinguished panel of experts this morning, and we sitting here at the podium also feel very fortunate to have you with us today. We know that a number of people here in the audience are also experts in this area. We look forward to hearing your thoughts, your reactions to the presentations, your perspectives, and the panel assures me that they would also appreciate outbursts of wild enthusiasm and violent agreement. I'm going to open by identifying the objectives of our panel and introducing the panelists. We can then move directly into the presentations and the questions and answers. Overall, our panel is about implementation of the guiding principles in high-risk conflict environments through multi-stakeholder initiatives such as the Voluntary Principles on Security and Human Rights and the International Code of Conduct for Private Security Providers. We begin with the premise that the Voluntary Principles and the ICOC are complementary to and mutually reinforcing with the guiding principles. From that premise, we will dig down to see how implementing these initiatives can contribute to the state duty to protect and the corporate responsibility to respect human rights under the guiding principles. We will also consider how the voluntary principles risk assessments address the due diligence element of the guiding principles. Areas affected by conflict and insecurity today present particular challenges for both states and businesses with respect to protecting and respecting human rights. When operating in environments where the protection of assets and personnel are key concerns, businesses frequently rely upon private and/or public security forces. Notably, host governments often require the use of public security forces, so this is not always a matter of choice for the companies involved. And as many of you are aware, most of the allegations of abuses are not, in fact, related to specific activities undertaken by companies, but are allegations that the companies were complicit in or aided and abetted in abuses by public security forces and perhaps did not do adequate due diligence before moving forward with their processes. In response to that kind of allegation and concern over abuses, the Voluntary Principles and the ICOC have been developed to set operating standards and guide business enterprises in meeting their respective duties and responsibilities to address abuses. The task of our panel is to address the effectiveness of these initiatives in promoting the guiding principles and improving respect for human rights on the ground. We will also seek to identify opportunities to strengthen these initiatives in a manner that is aligned with the guiding principles. For my introductions, I want to start this morning by recognizing Alex Guayqueta of the UN Working Group. Alex, I didn't see you this morning. Where are you? Will you wave to everyone? Well, you're somewhere out there hiding from us. All right. Welcome, Alex. To our panel, to my left here, Ambassador Claude, who is of the Swiss Federal Department for Foreign Affairs. And Claude is double-hatted today because as representing the Swiss government, he is also the chair, the governmental chair of the Voluntary Principles on Security and Human Rights. To Claude's left, Mark Wall, the Vice President for Security and Crisis Management at Barrick Gold, the world's largest gold mining company. To Mark's left, Egbert Wesslink, Senior Advisor to the non-governmental organization Pax Christi. The commentators to my right, Baiyewu with Global Rights Nigeria, and Minister Francisco Ura from the Office of the President of Colombia. We're delighted to have these panelists and commentators with us this morning. Each of the panelists will present for 7 minutes, and the commentators will then be asked to take 5 minutes to provide comments and value added to what the speakers have said. As I indicated earlier, we will keep everyone to strict time limits. After that, I will ask Alex if she would like to offer the first question to the panel, and I will subsequently take the prerogative of the chair to ask a question or two of my own. And we will then open it up to the floor. With that introduction, I'm going to turn to Ambassador Wild. Claude, could you please provide us with an introduction to the voluntary principles and the ICOC, explain how they relate to the guiding principles, and why is Switzerland involved in this? And then, more specifically, Switzerland is known internationally for being a great proponent of the law, rule of law, and taking a legal approach with respect to crisis management, particularly with respect, of course, to human rights issues. So why is Switzerland now, and why are you pursuing soft law initiatives such as the voluntary principles? And is that a contradiction to Switzerland's traditional position? And what does that say about Switzerland's perspective with respect to continuing strong support for the rule of law?
Everybody. It's indeed an honor, a privilege to be here and to discuss this very important issue with you today. Now, Gare, thank you for the question. It is true, Switzerland, being the depository state of the Geneva Convention and signatory of many human rights legal instruments, is a strong advocate for the legal way to defend human rights. But having nice convention is not enough. The challenge of human rights in the 21st century is implementation of the letter and the spirit of these conventions. And here we have to be smart. Here we have to be human rights engineers. And that's the great potential I see in voluntary approaches to human rights implementation by other actors as the state. And here we are fully in line with what the guiding principle invite us to explore as new avenues to really make a difference on the ground. So for us, joining in 2011 the Voluntary Principle Initiative on Security and Human Rights, which is specific for the extractive sector, was a logical step after the adoption in June 2011 of the UN Guiding Principle, because we saw that in this initiative we can have something already existing where we can make the spirit, where we can have the spirit of the UN Guiding Principle coming into life for a very specific industry, the extractive industry, in a very specific sector of this industry, the security of their operation. But if we want to have an impact, we should start with real and concrete things. And that was a nice thing about the Voluntary Principles Initiative. It was very focused. So we can really, on this niche, try to make a difference. So joining the soft law initiative, if they are smartly designed, and there are two criteria for being smartly designed. First, you have to be multi-stakeholder, not having just the industry regulating itself, but having it really with the civil society and with the states, and then you can have really a very good exchange and try to come forward into real issues of addressing human rights abuses. So multi-stakeholder, that is one criteria of an initiative being smart, and second, it has to have some kind of accountability mechanism or discussion on how one implements the principles and standards one designs into in this initiative. So these two criteria are met by the Voluntary Principles Initiative, and that's why we label it as a smart soft law initiative that has potential for real progress in its field of activity. The extractive industry, you know, it's a multi-billion business, and it often operates in fragile contexts or even in a conflict zone where it is difficult sometimes for host states to really fulfill their duty to protect human rights. So it is absolutely crucial when big corporations that are often home in our countries of the North, that they operate responsibly. And the whole mission of the Voluntary Principles initiative is to put criteria about what this responsibility means on the ground. So, you know it also, extractive industry have huge security operations. And these security operations are often subcontracted to private or public actors. And it's absolutely crucial that these actors are trained, are aware of their duties towards respect of human rights when they fulfill their security duty, especially if they are confronted with peaceful protest activities. Then there is another reason. Switzerland, as I said, is home of some of the big multinationals that are active in these zones, and we want to make sure that their activities and their presence is a stimulus for development and responsible operation, and not a way of having external, negative externalities on human rights where they operate. First, it's a duty for us to be sure that human rights are respected by companies that have their home address in Switzerland. And then second, if they operate well, there is a huge potential for a development that can be reached. And these corporations, if they operate responsibly, with responsibility, they can have a development impact that is way above the public aid that we are giving in these regions. So there is also a chance of having them as ally for our development efforts. And we have been active here in this room to promote the UN Guiding Principles. And we have really a smart document that is flexible enough to find solutions for each sector, in each region, and in each specific duties. So it would have been a shame, in our view, that we wouldn't have seized the occasion and tried to bring the spirit of the UN Guiding Principle into an initiative that exists since the year 2000, but that is now changing the paradigm of its activity. It is aligning itself with the spirit of the UN Guiding Principle, and it's becoming the way of putting this guiding principle into the extractive industry for their security responsibilities. And that is, for me, the great challenge, the great potential we can have here to really have this guiding principle put into the real world and not just being a nice document. I might stop here and be ready to ask, to answer questions should you address them to me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claude. We really appreciate your introduction. I'd like to turn now to Mark Wall from Barrick Gold. Mark, perhaps you could drill down a little bit from Claude's very high-level introduction and provide us some examples of specific corporate practices to implement the voluntary principles. And in addition, this is a voluntary initiative, and you didn't need to sign up. Barrick didn't need to become a participant in this. You might share with us why you're here and why you are a participant in the voluntary principles process.
The voluntary principles provide the only holistic framework to guide security operations for extractives companies who are operating in complex environments. Essentially, there's three parts. They guide front-end risk assessments looking at security and conflict, which is a key component of the voluntary principles. They also provide a framework for dialogue with public security groups, and they guide the approach of private security. Creating a platform for engagement with public security is one of the powerful aspects of the voluntary principles. And it's an area that businesses, extractives companies struggle with when operating in complex environments, often where they have no choice but to engage with public security groups. The voluntary principles, we heard from Professor Ruggie at our plenary last year in The Hague, where Professor Ruggie put the voluntary principles up as an example of a framework that has been out there for some time, but is an example of operationalizing his United Nations guiding principles. So what does that mean for a company when it comes to implementing? Firstly, it's about developing procedure and process, but that's easy. Companies are pretty good at that. The more difficult part is operationalizing that. How do you take policies and procedures and operationalize those so that they reflect on the ground? The struggle that companies have in many difficult locations is that materially all of their security force will be made up by nationals of their host country. And often these people have not been exposed to the concepts that are contemplated within the voluntary principles. So what we do is we have a process we call standardise localise. So we can create global level policies and procedures, but then we need to go through a process to understand how do we break this down in a way that it makes sense at a local level. That may be through language in some circumstances, or in others it's more complicated and we need to take account of cultural norms, practices, in order to make the procedures understood by those on the ground. I've seen this work well in one particular country where an organisation created comic books that were actually, they were quite interesting to read, but these comic books had threads of security and human rights through them, and they were used in training a particular public security apparatus, and it was a successful activity. The next part is assurance. So we can develop what it is we want people to do. We can figure out how to get that into a format that we can have it well understood, and then we need to assure ourselves that people are actually doing that. The best way that I found to do that is to have a dedicated group focused on the compliance of people in the field with key components of a voluntary principles program. What we've done in our company is linked the outputs of that to executive compensation, and I know other companies are looking at different iterations of those types of processes. When we look at assurance, for me there's three key parts to that: competent, capable and motivated. So the first one is competence. That is, people need the skill, the qualifications, the knowledge. They need to know what it is they're supposed to do. The second one is capable. So they need the resources, they need the capability on the ground to actually do that. And the third one is motivation. As with everything, there needs to be an advantage for doing it and a disadvantage for not doing it. So if things are more difficult to be done a certain way, the motivation is that it is linked to either a continuation of employment, it's linked to awards, it's linked to compensation, and if people choose not to do it, then it is linked to a disciplinary system. So having a focus on competence, capability and motivation is key when trying to embed these types of programs on the ground. I spoke earlier this year at a forum like this in Colombia, and interestingly, among the participants were many members of the Colombian security forces. And this to me was an example of continuing to develop competence, where the government of Colombia, I'm living in Canada, was well aware that it needed to continue to educate its senior members of its security forces, and there they were sitting around the room. I've got a couple more points. The first one is, from time to time, we see failures in ethics across sectors. And the public and private security sectors, we all know, are not immune from those failures. When we see breaches, whether that's in a law enforcement agency in one of our most sophisticated cities, or in a private security apparatus in a small developing country, There needs to be the capacity to identify such breaches, to interdict, and to make adjustments to the program where required, and then allow other processes like judicial and non-judicial grievance mechanisms to address remediation issues. In closing, my main message is that, from my perspective, there is no panacea to the issue of security and human rights. What is required is a focus on implementing and sustaining over time. Great procedures won't do it, and great auditing won't do it. It comes down to an organisation's will and the ability to make the voluntary principles or the guiding principles a part of the organisation's DNA, to have the right systems and to make this sustainable.
Thanks very much, Mark, for those very practical remarks and for bringing in a host government. Minister Lloreda will be able to address that a little bit with his experience with Colombia, so that's perfect dovetail. We turn now to our last panelist, Egbert Wesslink from Pax Christi. Egbert, you are the only NGO on the panel. Perhaps you can share with us why you are in this multi-stakeholder initiative, what value Pax Christi sees to the voluntary principles process, and maybe some of the specific contributions that your group has made to the process. Thank you.
Yes, we've been involved in the voluntary principles since 2003, so that's quite some time, and we're in it because we think it works. We think it does deliver something on the ground, even though we also believe that it is not a comprehensive answer to the issues that people on the ground are faced with, and it has to develop in order to fulfill its full promise. I will first pick up on Ambassador Claude Weil's call for an alignment of the voluntary principles with the guiding principles. Say something about what that would entail, because I think that's one of the main questions that probably interests you. The guiding principles limits responsibility to business to respecting human rights. The VPs goes beyond that. It says that business can also play a role in the promotion and protection of human rights. Now that's a much more active role. It means in practice in the VPs urge companies to relate to governments, to urge for investigations, to make sure that if there are violations that they are not repeated, etc. So that's a very protection is an active role, and I think in that sense the guiding principles can learn something from the voluntary principles. Now it's also the other way around, of course. The guiding principles lay great emphasis on the right to remedy. The voluntary principles do not even mention this right. The guiding principles detail state duties, while the voluntary principles focuses on companies, with state duties coming in only implicitly. And finally, the guiding principles calls for accountability, while so far the VPs have a very weak accountability process. So clearly, the guiding principles are complementary to the voluntary principles in these important matters, and aligning the voluntary principles with the guiding principles, from my perspective, would require integration of state duties in the definition of the responsibilities of government participants to the VPs, and that effective remedy provision becomes a performance criterion for both state and company participants. And finally, that the voluntary principles develop a credible assurance mechanism. We have a strategic plan that's been crafted under the Swiss presidency, and that foresees progress, I think, on all these three issues. Before going into Gare's question, what the VPs do for human rights, I want to say something about its character as a multi-stakeholder initiative. I think that is vital for it, but I'm not sure whether it fully functions well in that respect at this moment. As you may know, three very important human rights organizations have left the voluntary principles over the past year, and the NGOs that have come on board over the past years are mostly specializing in supporting implementation, so supporting companies to implement the VPs, and they are not so much in human rights advocacy. I think supporting companies to implement the VPs is a very important role for NGOs, but it should not dominate what the NGO pillar does. I think the voluntary principles process will lose credibility as a multi-stakeholder initiative if it's not attractive for human rights defenders. And that's another reason why I think the alignment, stronger alignment with the guiding principles is a necessity. Second question I'd like to answer is, how do the voluntary principles contribute to human rights? Well, the the vital innovative force of the VPs is the concept of security as a shared concern. The idea that companies are not secure unless affected communities are. A truly VPs compliant risk assessment will have to cover the risks to communities at par with risks to assets and personnel of companies. And companies and governments should not distinguish between the security and the rights of members of communities and that of assets and personnel of companies. This is a very powerful concept, and I think a major contribution to modern thinking about security and business. I believe that the voluntary principles has prevented and mitigated many human rights abuses, but it cannot measure that, of course. I mean, you cannot prove a negative. Still, there are reasons to believe that it has prevented human rights abuses. One of them is where, what Mark talks about, is that we see that its main requirements are integrated in the management processes of many, many companies. Not only the 22 corporate participants, also others are taking it on board. We see that security-related human rights issues have become top-level management concerns these days. Contracts with security providers include human rights provisions, including with state security providers. Training received, I see kind of dedicated experts working for businesses that were not there before. Security personnel is vetted, etc. And importantly also, the voluntary principles provides a very practical framework for dialogue with governments. And undoubtedly, I believe that has effect. Now, what that effect is, we don't know. We have not measured it. And I think that is, in general, with codes and principles like the UNGPs, and I think that's the new agenda for the future. We have to know and show the effect of codes and guidelines in order to be able to develop them further and make them more effective. And I think that is one of the other challenges of the voluntary principles. NGOs have been active. Some participating NGOs have been able to use the voluntary principles as an entry point to become semi-permanent advisors to companies with deep access into corporate structures and actually changing corporate cultures. They provide training to security providers, analyze company performance, advise improvements, carry out risk assessments. And as security issues cannot be isolated from the larger picture, from other issues, this leads NGOs like, well, for instance, Fund for Peace does that, to take a role in a broad range of things, from helping with MOUs, with public security forces, to being an active participant in company crisis management training. And I am convinced that this work has positive effect on security for communities and the human rights of vulnerable people. Unfortunately, we don't know, now back to the people where it's all about, the people whose rights are at risk. The most measurable results of the voluntary principles are policies and processes. That is what the process itself produces. And the assumption is sometimes that good-looking processes deliver handsome outcomes. Now, this is all very top-down, and top-down everything looks quite beautiful indeed. But for those whose rights the voluntary principles are supposed to protect, they do not experience the beauty of policies and processes. They experience what happens to their lives and livelihoods, and what they experience is often still ugly. Not always, or for everybody, and I'm convinced that it would look much uglier without the VPs, but still. Examples: there are company security officers with such close cooperation, such close relationships with police and military, such privileged relationships, that if the latter commit violations, victims cannot conclude otherwise than that the company has been complicit. I've seen community relation policies that look great on paper, while in fact increasing polarization in society. I've experienced how company culture can be resistant to the notion of shared security, etc. And of course, I know too many victims of human rights violations who are receiving no remedy whatsoever, too many people living under life threats because they are critical of company activities, and too many people who have experienced win-lose situations in the sense that they lose and companies win. For a process of 12 years old, that is a long list of disconnect between impressive and really good, and I think good intention management systems and observation experiences on the ground. So we have useful principles, they do work, but we're not yet where we should be. To bridge the gap between what policies should and what they do, deliver is paramount. The voluntary principles themselves are not disputed. They will eventually be judged for their success in protecting vulnerable people. And some we need to show results, deliver on remedy, integrate state obligations in our tripartite process, and engage host governments and give the voice of the most vulnerable people a bigger place, I think, in our process. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Egbert, and thanks to all three panelists for your very interesting presentations. I'm going to now turn to our two commentators, and then we'll get around to questions and the dialogue with you that we're really looking forward to. Baiyewu on my right from Global Rights Nigeria. Abi, perhaps in addition to commenting on what you've just heard from the panelists, you could explain a little bit of the relevance of the voluntary principles to countries like Nigeria and Ghana, where your group has worked. And then I have a personal question. I'd be interested in your perspective of the value that might be added to having the government of Nigeria as a participant in the process.
Okay, I think I'll start with your question. I'll be ecstatic if the government of Nigeria actually signs into the voluntary principles today. Today, before the government of Ghana or South Africa, or two governments are rearing to go ahead and sign into the voluntary principles as soon as possible. And I really appreciate what the panelists have, the message from the panelists today about soft law being about Switzerland and implementing the spirit and the letter of the law and making sure we provide an engineering platform for human rights actualization and not just the letter, but the spirit itself. And also that the voluntary principles right now, the only holistic framework for working, extractive industries working in complex environment, which Nigeria certainly is, and as a matter of fact, the entire West Africa. About the VPs for companies developing procedure and process and actually operationalizing them, and not just the process in the letter, but ensuring that the processes actually work, ensuring this competence, ensuring that people capable, this capability, and ensuring that we look at the motivation for actually ensuring the system works. It would be foolhardy for a country like Nigeria, excuse my language, not to sign onto the voluntary principles. Nigeria derives not just for internal mechanism for ensuring human rights for its citizens, but also it makes financial sense. Nigeria derives 95% of its national income from crude oil and is the 11th largest producer of crude oil globally. Nigeria right now is suffering from the divestment of some extractive companies from Nigeria because the environment has gotten more complex, and working in that environment isn't working for the companies anymore. And so if a country like Nigeria would sign into the voluntary principles, is my time over? No. Okay. If a country like Nigeria will sign into the voluntary principles, which makes absolute sense, that way it would take the forelead of not just the companies, the major companies in Nigeria have signed into the voluntary principles, but also ensure that it's expanding extractive industry, because it's going into mining as well, is able to provide a process that is accountable, and the motivation will not be just protecting its own people, but also ensuring the financial viability of its strongest industry. Ghana is also expanding its extractive industry. Recent discovery of hydrocarbons in Ghana has meant that its extractive industry is largely expanded. But then there are also issues in the already established industry, especially gold mining in Ghana, where there are a lot of illegal mining activities that compromise a multinational company activities and have, and as you must all know, have caused a lot of issues with human rights and security arrangements in Ghana. However, if the country like Ghana will go on to implement the voluntary principles, not as a knee-jerk reaction, but actual planning and working with the companies, they've actually signed into the voluntary principles, civil society, and the host communities, then Ghana has the hope of expanding and of sustaining its extractive industry, learning from countries like Liberia and Sierra Leone that have failed to do this and have resulted in civil in civil uprising, even in DRC. I believe if the voluntary principles had been implemented by those countries, perhaps we would tell a different story. What's Global Rights doing in Nigeria and Ghana? We've been working with civil society and government and helping to understand what the voluntary principles are about and how it can be implemented in Nigeria and in Ghana. Our work has not been largely with the extractive companies, but with civil society, host communities, and the government.
Thank you very much. That was very insightful. I'm sorry you were limited 2 minutes shorter than the panelists, but that's the way they set it up. Minister Lloreda, thank you so much for joining us this morning and coming from all the way from Colombia. You are the only speaker up here today from a host government perspective. I'd be very interested in hearing your thoughts in terms of the value that the voluntary principles provide to the government of Colombia, and Mark has alluded to some work that he's done down there. And also particularly, what can your government do to be effective in helping implement successfully this initiative?
Share with you what has been the experience of Colombia with VPs. Colombia has been a member and has been implementing VPs since year 2003. There's something interesting about the case of Colombia, and it is that we decided to establish what we call a mining and energy committee, which is basically a multi-stakeholder initiative, and which is the one responsible of moving forward with the VPs. At this moment, basically, 13 companies make part of this committee. Most of them are from the oil and gas and mining sector, but not all of them. And most of these companies are the ones who perhaps are in charge of most of oil, the oil business and mining business in Colombia. So we have the largest companies are there in the committee. I would say that it is very important, for example, that in the case of Colombia, companies feel comfortable, very comfortable working within the committee. This is very important. We have not, we do not need to go to recruit companies, so they, because they're the ones who wants to make part of the committee, and they are the ones who wants to implement voluntary principles. This is very important because if companies do not understand the benefit of it, it is going to be very difficult to move forward. In May of this year, and Mark mentioned it, we had an international workshop on voluntary principles and guiding principles, UN guiding principles in Colombia. It was basically what we call the government and companies vis-a-vis human rights. And it was very interesting because more than 10 countries participated, more than 400 people were there, around 47% were companies, and they were really interested in what was going on and the experience of this mining and energy committee. John Ruggie was there, John Morrison, and it was really good as an outreach experience. But allow me now to share with you 4 key issues that are going down, taking place in Colombia. The first one is that we've been able, and the companies who make part of this committee have been able to have MOUs with the Ministry of Defense, which is something that is very important because these MOUs include voluntary principles and some human rights standards, which is crucial for the relationship between companies and the military forces and the police. Second, we've been able within the committee to move forward with risk assessments. And there's risk assessment being done by companies with the support of the government. At the same time, the military forces, they have their own risk assessment and they share them with the companies. Third, we decided to establish a verification mechanism. Why this? Because this committee, as I was telling you, basically one of its main tools is that they issue recommendations for the companies. And these recommendations, the companies are obliged, those who are part of the committee, to put them in practice. So we established a verification mechanism with the companies, obviously, in order to to see how the VPs and their recommendations are put in place. Something which is also very important is that with international alert, and we've been able to establish some performance indicators, and these performance indicators have been very helpful to see how the VPs are being implemented by the companies. I want to remind you that the 13 companies that make part of this committee are the largest oil and mining companies in Colombia, and what we have seen is from them a great interest and commitment with VPs. Finally, I would like to tell you two things, and these are like two final remarks. The first one is that I believe that VPs have become an instrument in order to move in the direction of implementing the guiding principles of United Nations, obviously in a specific sector, but I think that it has been a wonderful experience. Second, and it is that it has been very important, and I want to highlight this, very important that we understand that this must be a joint effort between companies, between state, also with civil society, a joint effort. We have understood that companies must embrace voluntary principles, and the same should happen in the case of guiding principles. If companies do not embrace these initiatives, it's going to be very difficult, very hard to go into terrain and to make a change. So this is what I wanted to say at this moment. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Mr. Minister. And thanks to both of our commentators. This is great. We've wrapped up on time. As I promised, I will ask Alex if she's in here, and I can't see everybody. She's offered the first question if she'd like it from the working group. Otherwise, I'll ask one or two myself. Are you out there hiding somewhere, Alex? All right. In that case, I'll take the prerogative of the chair. I'll steal her question and ask one of my own. A little bit earlier, we alluded to the challenges of evaluating success of the voluntary principles, and I think Egbert, you said it's really difficult to make a good list of all the bad things that did not happen. You can't count negatives. So I would ask the panelists and the commentators, how do you really evaluate the success of the voluntary principles? And writ large, this could apply to other multi-stakeholder initiatives too. How do you evaluate the success of an initiative like this in increasing respect for human rights? What variables would you use to count a success or count a failure? Claude.
Well, thank you. The first success I could measure is we talk. We talk together where 10 years ago we would have worked in silos, pretending everybody to be engaged for human rights, against human rights abuse. Now we put the three worlds, civil society, corporation, that are the main pillars because they have the activities that can generate the positive or the negative impact, and the governments that have their state duty to protect. And the fact of having an initiative where we can really create the best practice, compare experiences, and have implementation guiding tools that are worked out that can be applied by the security managers is something that is already a success. How many conventions, human rights conventions, have a practical implementation guiding tool? We have the principles, and then it's up to each state to put it in practice. And we know that it is far from being always the panacea. So what I like about that, it is practical. And it has already changed the way human rights diplomacy is working. This I can also measure. I have now in my human rights department a business and human rights team, and a team that has in its duty to engage with corporations, 20 years ago, we were doing human rights foreign policy state by state, just addressing states. In the 90s, we really started to engage civil society and having projects with NGOs. And now, I would say, since John Uruguay's principle, at least in Swiss human rights diplomacy, we have active engagement with corporations. And that is, for me, the real challenge of the human rights engineering in the 21st century, is that we have the actors that make a difference on the ground, that are fully conscious of what it means to respect human rights. That, for me, is a measurable success. Of course, we still have gaps, as Egbert has said. Nobody in this room is perfect. No convention is perfect, and this initiative is not perfect either. But the direction, as the minister said, we are working towards implementing the UN guiding principle in a focused way for a very important sector. So that's my success story, I could say, at this time.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Wild, and you sit in a good seat to be able to have that perspective and share it with us. Would any of the other panelists or commentators care to comment on that question, or shall we move to the next? Yes, Mr. Minister.
I would say that 3 or 4 examples of why this is working. I would say first, as I shared with you, is the interest of companies, basically. And it is they understand the benefit, and they're the ones who ask to be part of voluntary principles. And this perhaps is not that common. And this is because, as I told you, they feel comfortable, they understand this benefit. Second is the will of companies on having some instruments, some tools like verification mechanism, performance indicators, and of course, we work these instruments together, but they have been totally prompt to have these tools. Third, for example, and it was mentioned, and it is, for example, the Ministry of Defense have understood its importance, and with the help also of some of the companies, more than 145,000 members of the military forces have been trained on human rights, on international humanitarian law. And so there's a work done with the Ministry of Defense. And last but not least, the interest and the commitment of companies to work with due diligence processes. So I would say that these are examples of how this initiative is moving forward.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister. Egbert?
Examples of success. I mean, when there is a violent incident in any mine of operation of our government company participants, we see disciplinary measures be taken. We see policies to be beefed up, etc., and all very clearly following the voluntary principles. Another example, a big issue 10 years ago was transfer of equipment. To police and others. Well, I haven't heard for many years about any incidents and problems with that. So I think that there are real, very specific VPs, results and successes to be accounted. Whether, of course, we evaluate success by what it does to the people whose rights are at risk, and there we shouldn't expect too much from the VPs. I must say, I mean, it's a brick in the wall. I remember we did almost 10 years a research in the Niger Delta where we asked quite a number of people in communities. We trained on human rights, etc. And we asked, well, is this going to solve any of your problems? And the general response was, human rights is not really a problem for us. Security is not really a problem for us. It's a problem for them, for the companies. And it is a problem for them because of us. And that is because we are poor, we're neglected, they don't seem to care for us, neither does our government, and they're the only ones we can access to. And by the way, they will do all kinds of bad things. So with a good VP's policy, you don't solve this fundamental social, economic conflict, of course. You need many other things. So I think the VPs, to be successful, it should be part of a much more broader, and it is often part of a much more broader approach that for which the companies cannot by themselves, deliver. We need host governments to be very, very actively involved in that.
Thank you, Egbert. Mark, unless you got a burning desire to respond, I'll go to the floor. But okay, yeah, please take it.
I will say, from the company's perspective, the VPs provide, as I've said, the only holistic framework. There's a myriad of circumstances and situations that can exist. The VPs allow the companies to develop procedures and systems within the 3 areas of focus. They allow structured engagement with public security, and in many instances, the company has no choice but to engage with the state security apparatus. The VPs provide a very effective platform for dialogue with the state when there is an incident, and these are sensitive times, and it is a significant advantage for both VP and non-VP members to be able to engage with the state using the VPs as the platform for that engagement. The success of the VPs is and can be measured by the engagement that takes place, the training that takes place within the public security apparatus. As an example, the number of people that are trained by VP members is enormous. The different programs that the oil and gas and the mining companies have operating in developing countries to provide training or support training in the space of security and human rights to the public security agencies is substantial and does make a difference over time.
Thank you very much. Well, we're now going to open it up to the floor. Where we're sitting, we can see something you can't, which are the signs. We have all the states here. If you want to come and talk, please come down and either sit here on the states part here where there's a microphone, in the business section, which is directly in front of me, or in the NGO section right here. And we welcome anyone who has a question to please come down. And make sure you're seated there so that you have an opportunity to use the microphone. I will try and divide equally opportunities for those 3 sectors to speak, since there's no one seated there from the states right now. I think I'll start with the NGOs and then go to the business. Is the woman seated here? Maybe just to start from left. All right, we'll start with the gentleman to the right there. Would you like to ask the first question, sir?
Thank you, Mr. Chair and panelists, for the opportunity to speak at this session. I'm Joel Bissina from Light Africa in Nigeria. I want to lend my voice to the discussion and the debate that the VP provides a credible platform, an opportunity, an entry point to the discussion and debate on the issue of human rights, especially in complex mineral resource rich environments like Nigeria and in the Niger Delta. Since 2006, Light Africa has been using the VP as a tool to facilitate discussions and debates on the issues of human rights between communities, oil companies, and security forces. And because of a soft law approach to the discussion and the debate, it seemed to have provided an opportunity for an easy entry for the discussion. And I must say here that we've recorded some successes. The discussions have provided some corridors of hope on expanding the discussion and the debate on the issue of human rights. I also know that Nigeria is yet to sign on it, but I think it will be important and very imperative that we all have a better understanding on how we engage on some discussions. Sometimes approaches by some Western nations to Nigeria and other nations, especially in the developing world, on some issues, sometimes they don't provide the opportunity for rapid engagement. The multi-stakeholder approach to discussion, I think, is key. Sometimes naming and shaming does not help. It just needs understanding understanding of the complex and difficult socio-cultural and political environment in which some of these discussions are happening. But I must say here that in Nigeria, we are recording some success. With it, we've been able to presently engage at some higher level with the even general security forces. And there is some embrace of issues of human rights. Are we where we want to be? No, we are not. There is still room for improvement. But I must say that to continue to record successes will mean having a better understanding and giving opportunity to all sides to be able to explain and discuss their issues. You know, because in complex environments, sometimes it's difficult to understand. And you know, to think that one side is good or one side is bad does not really help the situation. We just all need to come to a common understanding that we are all in this. We may have one way or the other contributed to the issues, so we all have a solution to it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. And I neglected to remind everyone that all the speakers, please identify yourself when you start, and we're all limited to 2 minutes. There are obviously a lot of people who want to talk to, so to be polite to your colleagues, do please keep your time into 2 minutes. So thank you very much for your comments, sir. Why don't we turn to the business community?
Thank you. I'm from IPICA, the Oil and Gas Industry Association for Environmental and Social Issues. And I'd like to take the opportunity to share another success in relation to this area of work. As acknowledged in this session, in resource-rich countries, potential security issues can affect livelihoods of local populations, also company employees and contractors, as well as cause costly delays to new projects and operations. Therefore, addressing these potential security issues proactively by developing and implementing responsible security operations helps to ensure the safety and sustainability of the operating environment, and this is critical for business success. So this year, IPICA furthered its body of work by broadening its scope and range of activities. We launched a series of good practice workshops for our members, and these explore specific concrete issues surrounding the challenges and successes in country on implementation. And we believe these efforts complement that of initiatives such as the Voluntary Principles and the UN Guiding Principles. So this is the success we'd like to share. Thank you.
Oh, yes, good. We've got some state representatives, please.
My name is Fuad. I'm from Yemen. I represent the Ministry of Human Rights. I'm the director of the Minister's Office. I don't have a success story this day, but we will build together this story. Although, as I said, that I am a government representative, but I will not speak in favor of the government because I am a human rights officer. As you know, Yemen faces challenges of Al-Qaeda and drones. But let me only put my hand on one issue related to the topic of security and human rights. In 2012, the president of Yemen issued a strategic, comprehensive plan for anti-terrorism. But last month, we were surprised that he's giving orders to issue a strategic, comprehensive plan for fighting the ideology of Al-Qaeda. Now, my question is, does anybody feel that we are separating, with the second strategy, we are separating the human rights concern from any security concern? Of course, accordingly, we can know where the official security or private security stand. And my question is, can the principles discussed today enhance the relation between security and human rights? Of course, one thing to say, or last thing, that I've been here since 2 days, and I announced before yesterday that we in Yemen have launched 1 week ago the Yemeni Forum for Business and Human Rights. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that, sir, and thank you for your work in human rights in Yemen. I see some very quizzical looks on the faces of the panelists. I'm wondering if you could distill your question into one sentence, because we're not quite sure how that related to the presentation. Sorry. Could you repeat your question, because I don't think people are able to respond to it quite the way it was phrased.
Yes. Well, my question is why do you feel that security and human rights are much related? Because as we see in Yemen, in my country, the politics is trying to put aside the human rights and security concerns. While if we have those two on one table, I think we will reach to the mandates of human rights in principle.
Thank you. That clarified it. Ambassador Wild.
That last question, maybe just you put a broader question, is the one that where stands human rights when you have a security concept, national security concepts, and counter-terrorism strategies. I just repeat that this initiative that we present today is the Security and Human Rights Voluntary Principles initiative for the extractive industry. So what would be very advisable is, since Yemen has put up a forum for business and human rights, that they engage with the member companies of the voluntary principles that operate in Yemen, and there are several, mainly oil companies that operate in Yemen, in order that they address this specific issue, which is separate from the broader question, which would need another panel, is on to what extent are counter-terrorism policies threatening general human rights approaches. That is an issue for another panel, but it is a very critical question for this Human Rights Council, I would say. It is debated every year, and it is still on the table on how to find the right mix, but it's another debate than the one we are having right now.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Wild. We have a lot of questions, and we have to stay within our time limit. So what we're going to do is I'm going to take 3 questions in a row and then have the panelists try and respond to them. So why don't we take the next from civil society, then I'll go to business, and then back to the states. Please identify yourself first, please, in 2 minutes.
I'm Patricia Feeney from Rights and Accountability and Development. I've done a lot of work on conflict-affected countries in Africa, and I'm also a board member of the International Code of Conduct Association. So my question is, do we think, given the problems of credibility with the VPs as a multi-stakeholder initiative that was alluded to by Pax Christi, that this is enhanced by having the Secretariat located in a corporate law firm, many of whose clients are actually leading multinational companies in the oil and mining sector? And is it compatible either with the VPs or the GPs, the guiding principles, for Africa Barrick Gold, Africa Barrick in its North Mara mine, where it's had problems with security issues, which are actually a case before the UK courts at the moment, for it to impose a waiver requirement on people getting compensation, which blocks them from not only bringing a claim on their own behalf against the company in many jurisdictions, including Canada and the UK, but also prevents them from assisting others to bring claims against the company. Thank you.
Turn to the business group for the next question.
Good morning, Chairman and members of the forum. I would like to speak of the positive experience. I'm from the Russian Federation, and I'd like to speak of Russian agriculture. This is not an extractive industry, but I would like to speak, because at the legislative level in Russia, staff safety is monitored, but not always respected fully in corporations. But I wanted to speak about compliance with that in the Russian Agricultural Bank. There are specific examples. Nobody has insurance. There can be an accident, and I wanted to say that the commissions meet when this happens, not only state commissions, but also internal commissions to examine these cases when there's been an accident. And staff can be insured, there can be compensation paid. There are some positive examples which could be spread to other organizations. We could share our experience. I think it is very important. In this way, human rights are upheld. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Yes. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak. Mine is more a statement, I suppose, rather than a question. I'm from the UK delegation, the FCO, now Human Rights Department. And as you may know, we launched our action plan to implement the guiding principles in September this year. And I think this area is very important. We played a leading role in developing the International Code of Conduct, which I know was mentioned just now, for private security service providers, the ICOC. It sets out companies' commitments to standards of behavior, particularly on human rights, and will be independently audited. This ICOC standard was launched this September as well. And on the voluntary principles, which obviously is a key discussion today, the UK is looking forward to taking on the chairmanship of the voluntary principles on security and human rights from March 2014 to 2015. We will use our chairmanship to encourage more governments and UK companies to join the VPs and to strengthen implementation of the VPs through increased accountability and transparency. The VPs are an important part of the UK's conflict prevention strategy. Membership helps to reduce the human rights-related risks of providing security around extractive company operations. It also helps to encourage investment by reducing the operational, legal, and reputational risks that companies face in connection with security. We hope you will consider, other states will consider joining the VPs, and interested in to know your views on the initiative, and would be happy to discuss this further in other fora. Many thanks.
Thank you very much. We appreciate it, and we appreciate the steps the UK has taken, and look forward to the chairmanship next year with the voluntary principles. I had said we'd go through 3 questions, but it's been recommended to us that there's so many questions out there that we listen to some more and then have the panel respond to as many as they can. So why don't we come back then to civil society and then back to business and pick up a few more questions. Civil society next.
Thank you very much. Anabela Cibrián is my name. I represent the International Platform Against Impunity. I wanted to comment on the first and second pillar of the guiding principles, and it's very important to have the contribution from various stakeholders to prevent human rights violations. So on that basis, I wanted to ask what multinational companies can do to make sure that as a minimum, countries adopt the voluntary principles on security and human rights. How can they be more proactive than they already are being? And secondly, a question on the third pillar of the guiding principle, which relates to remedy. First of all, mention a very good example of good practice on justice between states, which held this year. On the 22nd of July, judges in Italy and Canada issued a ruling saying that in their country, crimes ought to be judged which had been committed in Guatemala relating to sexual violence against 11 indigenous women. And this saw the involvement of Guatemala companies as well. The acts were committed in 2007. Adolfo G.Ch. Shaman was also murdered in 2009, and there was a beating that led to somebody being paralyzed for life. Now, all of this was done in conjunction with the Guatemalan Public Prosecution Service. They ensured that that company was prosecuted and ended up in jail. Now, how can we ensure that such cooperation takes place? The country, involving the country where the company is operating and the country of origin of the company cooperate. Such cooperation would ensure that crimes of this type don't go unpunished, and it would also ensure that companies actually improve their conduct. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have another business person lined up? I can't quite see everybody there. Thank you. Please go ahead, sir.
Thank you. My name is Nigel Lockwood. I'm here representing G4S, a UK-based multinational security company. Following a review of human rights standards within our group, we launched our human rights framework in April alongside the 2013 update of our ethics policy, and since then have been working to implement the guiding principles across our company and moving beyond just the existing focus on the voluntary principles and ICOC in our extractive and complex environment businesses. I was pleased to note the panel's comments today and the intention to review and strengthen the voluntary principles over the next year, and hope that this will help to align the VP's standards, implementation and guidance with the guiding principles and the existing ICOCA. And to say that we look forward to learning more about this process and are keen to engage with it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think what I'll do now is I'm going to turn to the panelists and let them respond to some of these questions. It looks like we have about 4 more from the NGO civil society, and I'll come back to those 4. We've got about 15 minutes to try and respond to some of these first. Okay? Yes, thank you. Yes. Anyone, panels, commentators, you'd like to start? Egbert, yes.
Yes, two responses. One is to Patricia's question whether this secretariat is the right one. Sure, Foley Hoag also advises companies, but I must say that and I think I speak for everybody within the NGO community, we think that their services have been excellent and totally unbiased. And I agree formally, from the looks of it, maybe it shouldn't have been an ideal choice, but in practice it's been a very good choice. I'd like to state that. Then the question from the gentleman on multi-stakeholder initiatives and the multi-stakeholder dimension. He talked about Nigeria. I think what is really fundamentally missing in the architecture of the voluntary principles this time, at this time in history, is real multi-stakeholder in-country processes. Only that would, I think, fill a big void that we're having, is that we don't have the voices of the vulnerable communities, local NGOs, etc., in a real debate on security and human rights, even though the VPs do impose that, as it's in the thinking of the VPs that exists. And in practice, an important first step for that to be realized is membership of host governments. But even that does not guarantee it. I mean, I really think that the company and host government participants should be much more open to real multi-stakeholder tripartite discussions on security and human rights. I mean, there are all kinds of confidentiality issues, there are all kinds of trust issues, but unless we overcome that, I think we will continue to have a serious credibility issue within the voluntary principles. Thank you.
Thank you, Egbert. Mark? Yeah.
Perhaps I'll just follow on, Gare, with Patricia's question. With regard to ABG, again, I can't speak on behalf of African Barrick Gold. They are a subsidiary, a 74% owned subsidiary of my company listed in the UK with an independent board. I certainly can't speak on behalf of their judicial or non-judicial grievance mechanisms, but I do have knowledge of their Voluntary Principles program. They do have a comprehensive program. They've also engaged with the international NGO Search for Common Ground. Search for Common Ground is in Tanzania providing training to both public and private security personnel in the area of security and human rights generally.
Mr. Ambassador?
Thank you. On several issues. First, the ICOC has been mentioned several times, so the Code of Conduct for Private and Security Providers. This initiative for the private security providers industry shows that soft law approach can work, because here we really were able within 2 years to change world governance on how this industry works. And so for me, that's the goal to reach also for the VPs. Now, one often compares the two initiatives. Of course, the ICOC, it was easier for them because when they were established, when the code was established in 2010, we were very near to the end of John Ruggie's work. So it could come into it more logically. With the VPs, we have an initiative that started in the year 2000 in the paradigm of a global compact, which is a different paradigm than the Ruggie paradigm. And that's why now we are in this process of alignment. But it is a process that requires dialogue because members signed up in year 2000 to another spirit. And it is up to us, the states and the civil society and the companies that have understood the change of paradigm to bring on board all the others of the corporate pillar of this initiative. That's why it is advancing at a different speed than the ICOC. It has to be understood. I also want to a bit challenge Egbert, my dear friend Egbert, on the credibility issues, because we have been out on the ground to see what actually in country the initiative is producing, because it's not just a talk shop that gathers in working group and established standards and principles. It has a life, in-country life. And I'm just back from an outreach mission to Peru, where the initiative is really living in the dialogue in country. And even that the country of Peru has not signed yet up to the initiative, they participate actively in the debate with the companies, and you have civil society organizations that are not members of the VP that are also participating, and that's the spirit. It is in a country where mining is so important as Peru, there is a forum existing, and the Embassy of Switzerland has there the lead to convene this forum. It's now part of their diplomatic work there. This also is new, and issues that often go beyond the security issues that is the mandate of the VP, but human rights are discussed in a multi-stakeholder approach with the participation of the government, and that's positive. And that's why I think you cannot be so radical in saying that there is no in-country life of the initiative. There is, but you need to be engaged in make it live. And then there was a question about how can we get more host government, more resource-rich country into the initiative. That also is a big challenge, not only for corporations that, of course, have to have this dialogue with their host country, but for us, the member countries, to have diplomatic activities that explains the benefit of the VPs to the resource-rich country, that are able to explain that it is not a new Western-type initiative to control resources, but that it is a win-win-win approach, win for the potential victims, win for the sustainability of an industrial operation that can be positive for development, and win for the state duty to protect for the host state in terms of human rights. And that I wanted to add to the discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Mr. Minister, please.
Thank you very much. I want to make two comments in this way to answer some of the questions. The first one, I want to reinforce something that I said before, which is that VPs, and the same would apply for guiding principles. They're very important, they're very useful tools, but in order for them to be successful, they have to be the result of a joint effort. And I say this because from the experience that we have had in Colombia, and perhaps is useful for some of you, is that getting the interest of companies have been crucial. If companies do not understand this benefit, it's going to be very difficult. Allow me to be very blunt on what I'm going to say, and it is that voluntary principles, and at the same, I would say for guiding principles. Without the commitment of companies, these principles can fall in a vacuum, to tell you the truth. So it is very important to work hand in hand with them. In the case of Colombia, for example, this mining and energy committee, for example, is more. It is a teamwork. What we see that is happening there. It is not a boxing ring. It is not a boxing ring. And I think it's very important to take this into account. Second, that I wanted to say is that obviously the story of each country and this experience with voluntary principles is different, and some are moving faster, some are moving slower. But in the case of Colombia, and this is the experience we have had, it is allowing us to make a difference in terrain. And when I was sharing with you what has to do with the verification mechanism, the performance indicators, due diligence, it is that things are happening in terrain. And this has been possible because we have also committed to build trust between the different stakeholders. This is very important, to build trust and to understand that it is a responsibility, yes, of the state, of the companies, of civil society, to commit to human rights and to make a difference in terrain. If not, perhaps some of these things can fall into our rhetoric, and that's not the purpose. So there is as I say, I believe every country is moving differently at different pace. In the case of Colombia, we have had a very important experience. That doesn't mean that we have all problems solved. No, there's many challenges ahead, difficult challenges, a long way to go, but I think we're moving in the right direction. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Lloreda. Abi, would you like to add to that? Or?
I very much, I can't remember your name, but I very much share your sentiment about home governments being engaged in the process and the voluntary principles. However, if the in-country process is not commenced, it's going to be a bit difficult. And so encouraging host countries like Nigeria and other resource-rich countries to sign into the voluntary principles becomes an imperative. And that way we get home governments to become more responsive about the activities of their nationals in other countries. I hope that helps.
Thank you, Abby. I'm told we will lose our translators if we do not stay on time, so Mark wants very much to address the credibility issue, and then I will wrap it up. I'm sorry we don't have another half hour to keep going. Mark?
This credibility question comes up, and I find it quite interesting. The Voluntary Principles has a formal participation criteria that is written within the governance rules. It has a formal annual reporting requirement. It has an internal grievance mechanism where members make complaints against other members in a formal mediated process. It has an annual public report that is released by the Secretariat. It has companies undertaking customised verification work at different levels in different areas of the world. Over the past several years in the plenary, we've had detailed presentations on implementation and challenges from companies, and that continues to evolve. We now have the government and the NGO pillars working on their own verification frameworks to validate the work that they do. And we have Ambassador Wild and the Swiss government who have done some very good work in developing the strategy to pull all of this together, to pull the voluntary principles forward. So I see the voluntary principles as credible, and I see the accountability framework as credible.
I'm told the translators are being very generous, and we can take... You didn't say. I'm told we were to ask the translators for their patience for a few moments, if we could. that correct? Okay, to take two more questions, one from the civil society and one from the government. Very, very briefly, please.
My name's Stephen Winstanley. I'm with the Institute for Multistakeholder Initiative Integrity, also known as MSI Integrity. I was encouraged by your question about what makes an MSI effective, as that's what a lot of our research is going into. We're an independent nonprofit. We're dedicated to ensuring that MSIs protect and promote human rights through effective institutional design and particular concern for the inclusion and impact of local communities. We've been observing the VPs for a few years, and I've been encouraged to hear a discussion of verification mechanisms and accountability mechanisms. We're excited to hear this, and we would like to ask if there's a specific timeline for when such a monitoring and accountability mechanism may be implemented, because in our research, this is an essential element. An independent, well-designed, and empowered monitoring and accountability mechanism is an essential element to MSIs effectively ensuring the protection and promotion of human rights. Thank you.
Thank you. Government.
Thank you, Chair, for the opportunity. I'm Dupito Simomora from the Coordinating Ministry for Political, Legal, and Security Affairs of Indonesia. While Indonesia is yet to be a member of the Voluntary Principles, through consultation with the government, the principles have been implemented by a number of transnational corporations in Indonesia. And this, I think just now, one of the panelists suggested on the need for stronger alignment between voluntary principles and the UNGPs. In that connection, I have a question to make. Are there lessons learned on how to design a coherent approach of both processes at national levels, while taking into account that some countries like Indonesia are still in the process of having a national action plan on the UNGPs? Thank you.
Thank you. I was told we did not have time for answers, so what I'm going to ask is that you two gentlemen come on up here. We'd be delighted to discuss and address both of your questions directly, but I can't take the time right now to have everybody do it. So I'm going to wrap it up. This has been terrific. These are my bullet points. In wrap-up, the guiding principles provide governments and businesses with high-level guidance regarding their respective responsibilities to protect and respect human rights. The voluntary principles and the ICOC operationalize guidance for the extractive sector with respect to due diligence and how to demonstrate respect for human rights in the context of the provision of security. They are complementary to and not competitive with the guiding principles. They contribute to the guiding principles by providing specific direction to governments and members of the extractive and security sectors regarding how respect for human rights can be maintained in complex and difficult environments. This is particularly true through the incorporation of best practices, such as embedding in contracts, rule of law, training, monitoring, closing gaps. These are some of the best practices. And I liked Mark's linking success to executive compensation. That tends to get attention. It's especially important for companies working with public security forces whose activities the companies do not control. Key practical due diligence measures related to the identification of security risks, including the potential for violence, human rights records, rule of law, conflict analysis, and guidelines regarding the transfer of equipment, contribute significantly to the ability of companies to manage security and human rights risks. And best practices have also created a framework for verification, which comes back to your point. Success on the ground, following Minister Lloreda's comments, is often tied to, and I would dare say even proportionate to, the willingness of host governments to recognize human rights challenges and work with companies and NGOs to implement the voluntary principles to secure a win-win-win scenario for governments, companies, and affected citizens. With that closure, I'd like to thank the panelists, the commentators, and all of you for your questions, input, and a very productive session. Thank you so much.